Have you ever stopped to think about those really huge figures in history? I mean, not just people who lived and died, but the ones who didn't just change things. They kind of fundamentally reshaped everything. People whose lives were maybe short, but just incredibly brilliant, leaving this mark that, well, that echoes for centuries, created whole new ways of seeing the world. Today, we're diving deep into one of those colossal figures, a name that, wow, even millennia later, still carries so much weight.
Indeed. We are talking, of course, about Alexander the Great, and for a lot of people, that name just screams conquest, pure military might. And okay, yes, he was an absolutely unparalleled military commander, no doubt about that. But his story is so much richer. There's this amazing vision mixed in there for cultural unity, even intellectual progress. Born 356 BCE, died 323 BCE. So young, and in that short time, he carved out one of history's largest empires. Became a legend while he was still alive, sure, but more than that, his life really marks this huge turning point in human history. He was always walking this incredibly fine line, wasn't he, between raw, brutal power and these, well, grand ideals.
Right. And our mission for you, the listener, in this deep dive is to really sift through the sources we have on Alexander. There's a lot there, and it's fascinating stuff. We want to explore his military genius, obviously, but also that surprising, sometimes controversial cultural vision he had, and his legacy, which is just so enduring, so multifaceted. The goal is you walk away with a really solid, comprehensive understanding, but one that's, quickly digestible.
Yeah.
How this one Macedonian king just profoundly shifted the path of both Eastern and Western history. We're looking for those nuggets of knowledge, those aha moments that make you really get the man, his time, the impact.
Precisely. The core question really is, how on earth did one person achieve so much, conquer so much land, kickstart such huge cultural shifts, all in, what, just over a decade of campaigning? And maybe, what can we learn from his story? It's extraordinary, but also, like you said, full of contradictions. So we'll explore not just what he did, the battles, the cities founded, the empire building, but try to get at the why. Why did it matter? What were the ripple effects through time? And what was he up against? Both outside forces and maybe his own internal struggles.
Nice.
Formative years, shaping the young conqueror.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before he was Alexander the Great, before all the legendary campaigns in the empire, where did he actually come from? We tend to focus so much on the sheer scale of what he did, we sometimes forget the crucible that forged him. What's the origin story?
Yeah, that's absolutely the place to start. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella. Pella was the capital of Macedonia back then, a kingdom sort of on the edge of the main Greek world, but one that was rapidly becoming a major power. And his upbringing, it was just steeped in power, ambition, this relentless drive for greatness. And that came largely from his parents, who were, well, powerful and often conflicting influences. His father, Philip II, was a truly transformational figure himself. You can't understand Alexander without understanding Philip. Philip inherited a Macedonia that was relatively minor, a bit fragmented, looked down upon by some southern Greeks, and through just sheer strategic brilliance, military innovation, and pretty ruthless diplomacy and conquest, he turned it into the major Greek power. He created this incredibly disciplined professional army. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about training, equipment, tactics. He introduced the sarissa, that incredibly long pike.
Right, the super long spear that made the phalanx so formidable.
Exactly. That gave his infantry a huge advantage. And he perfected combined arms tactics, integrating heavy infantry with fast, powerful cavalry. He drilled his soldiers constantly. He was a master of logistics, siege warfare, and he led from the front. He famously lost an eye in a siege. He understood hardship. So Philip essentially built the military and political engine. He laid the groundwork, created the launch pad from which Alexander would then, shoot for the stars. It was a tough act to follow, definitely, but he gave Alexander the tools he needed.
Okay, so the father builds the war machine, the political structure, but his mother, Olympias, wow, she seems like a totally different kind of influence. Almost mystical, maybe even a bit dark.
Oh, absolutely. A world apart from Philip in many ways. Olympias came from the royal family of Epirus, a lineage they claimed went all the way back to Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War. And her influence on Alexander was deeply mystical, intensely religious, and fiercely ambitious for her son. The sources paint her as this passionate, maybe even volatile figure. She's apparently devoted to mystery cults, particularly the ecstatic rites of Dionysus. There's lots of snakes involved, apparently. And she instilled in Alexander from a very young age this powerful belief that he wasn't just Philip's son, that he was divinely chosen, maybe even the son of Zeus himself.
Wow. That's a heavy thing to put on a kid.
It is. But think about the effect. She nurtured this conviction with stories, omens, prophecies about his destiny for greatness. And this belief, this absolute conviction that he was special, favored by the gods, destined for world-changing things, it became a bedrock of his confidence, his unwavering self-belief. It's almost impossible to overstate how much that kind of deep-seated belief, fostered from childhood, must have fueled his actions. His resolve in battle against crazy odds, his decisions as a ruler, it gave him this aura, this almost untouchable quality.
And then, okay, this part is just wild to me. At 13 years old, he gets Aristotle as his personal tutor. I mean, forget your average high school teacher. This is the Aristotle. How did that shape him? Was it just like military strategy 101 or something much, much bigger?
It was extraordinary. A privilege that's hard to even comprehend for a young prince back then. And no, it was far, far broader than just military tactics. Aristotle tutored him from about age 13 to 16, and the curriculum was incredibly comprehensive. Encyclopedic, really. We're talking philosophy, political science, logic, ethics, rhetoric, but also natural sciences. Aristotle was a keen observer of the natural world, so biology, zoology, botany.
So he's learning about animals and plants alongside politics and logic.
Exactly. And literature, Homer was supposedly a favorite. Aristotle prepared a special annotated copy for him. Art, too.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about cramming facts. It was about fostering intellectual curiosity, critical thinking, a real breadth of knowledge about the world. They probably went on field trips, collected specimens, debated the nature of the universe.
So it's not just how to win a war, it's how to think, maybe even how to rule.
Precisely. And a really key part of this, though historians debate its actual impact, was Aristotle's focus on ethical leadership. We know Aristotle taught him from works like his Nicomachean Ethics, so discussing the virtues needed in a ruler, justice, courage, moderation, reason, how to govern people well for the good of the community, the polis. This was meant to be character formation, not just book learning, shaping him into a moral, philosophical leader. But here's where it gets complicated, and you touched on this earlier. Aristotle, like many Greeks of his time, had pretty, shall we say, strong views about non-Greeks, barbarians, especially Eastern cultures. He saw them as inherently inferior, maybe suited for being ruled over.
And Alexander later goes on to conquer those very cultures.
Exactly. So did Alexander initially absorb those ethnocentric views? Probably, to some extent. Yet later in his campaigns, we see him doing surprising things, adopting Persian dress, marrying Eastern women, integrating Persians into his administration, things that directly contradicted that kind of Greek superiority complex.
So did he just pick and choose from Aristotle, use the philosophy when it suited him, ignore it when it didn't? Or did his experiences actually change his worldview, challenge what his famous tutor taught him?
That's the million drachma question, isn't it? It's likely a bit of both. He certainly used the intellectual tools Aristotle gave him for governance and strategy. But his experiences on the ground, interacting with these sophisticated ancient cultures like Persia and Egypt, must have broadened his perspective beyond Aristotle's somewhat narrow view. This tension between the ideal philosopher-king Aristotle might have envisioned and the pragmatic, ambitious, sometimes brutal conqueror Alexander became is absolutely central to understanding him. That education wasn't just knowledge. It shaped the very lens through which he saw the world and his place in it. The swift ascent, consolidating power and eyeing Persia.
Okay, so we have this young man, incredibly well-educated, divinely inspired according to his mother, son of a military genius, and then suddenly everything changes. The story of his rise is just pure drama. Philip II, his father, is assassinated. 336 BCE, Alexander's only 20 years old, he's thrust onto the throne. That must have been incredibly precarious.
Absolutely chaotic. A real trial by fire for someone so young. It can easily have all fallen apart right there.
Oh, maybe?
When Philip was killed, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards during a wedding celebration, no less, Macedonia was instantly plunged into instability. You had potential rivals within the royal family eyeing the throne. You had powerful generals who'd served Philip for years, maybe wondering if this 20-year-old kid was up to the task. And at the same time, boom, across Greece, city-states that Philip had brought under Macedonian control, often pretty resentfully, saw their chance. They thought, okay, the strong man's gone, maybe we can break free.
So threats from inside Macedonia and outside, all at once.
Exactly. It was a moment where a lesser leader, someone less decisive or, frankly, less ruthless, might have just been swept away. But Alexander, despite his age, acted with astonishing speed and, well, brutality. He moved immediately to eliminate potential rivals to the throne. The throne rivals were executed or forced into exile. He secured the loyalty of the key army commanders, the bedrock of Macedonian power. He crushed internal dissent with an iron fist. It showed a political cunning and a capacity for decisive, harsh action that was frankly terrifying in someone so young.
Yeah.
He wasn't just reacting, he was seizing control, imposing his will, making it clear he was in charge.
Okay, so he clamps down hard on the home front. What about Greece? How does he get all those notoriously independent, proud city-states back in line? That feels like herding cats, but with spears.
Well, this is where we see that chillingly pragmatic side of Alexander really come to the fore. The key moment, the example that sent a shockwave through the entire Greek world, was his handling of Thebes. Thebes was a major city-state, ancient, powerful, proud history. They revolted, apparently spurred on by rumors that Alexander had been killed fighting northern barbarians.
Yeah.
Big mistake. Alexander marched his army south at incredible speed, covering huge distances. He completely surprised the Thebans. Then, after they refused to surrender, he besieged the city, stormed it, and unleashed utter devastation.
Just sacked it.
Sapped it, doesn't even cover it. He razed the city to the ground, literally leveled it. Supposedly, the only things left standing were the temples and the house that had once belonged to the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired. And thousands of Theban citizens were killed. The survivors, maybe 30,000 people, were sold into slavery.
Wow. That's brutal.
It was absolutely brutal. But it was also brutally effective as a message. This wasn't just punishing Thebes, it was a terrifying object lesson for every other Greek city-state. The message was crystal clear. Defy Macedonian leadership, and this is your fate, annihilation. And it worked. Other cities, including Athens, which had been considering supporting Thebes, quickly backed down. They fell into line. So through this act of extreme violence, he effectively unified Greece under his command, which was crucial. Because he needed Greece secure, he needed Greek soldiers for the next big step.
The invasion of Persia.
Exactly. The grand project his father Philip had been planning just before his assassination.
Huh.
So alongside consolidating political control, Alexander was simultaneously tuning up that military machine, building on Philip's reforms, making sure the army was disciplined, motivated, ready for the biggest campaign imaginable. This wasn't just about battles won. It was about psychological dominance and meticulous preparation for taking on the largest empire the world had ever seen. 3. The Persian campaigns. Unveiling military genius.
Right, so Greece is locked down. The army's ready. Alexander, full of ambition, maybe that divine sense of destiny, sets his sights east, on the Persian Empire. Colossal, ancient, incredibly wealthy. He crosses the Hellespont into Asia Minor in 334 BCE. He's leading, maybe 40,000 men? Against an empire stretching from Egypt to India. What was that first big test, the first major clash that really announced his arrival?
That would be the Battle of the Granicus River, right near the coast of Asia Minor. It was his first major engagement against a Persian field army. This wasn't Darius III himself yet, but the local Persian satraps, the governors, had gathered their forces, including a lot of excellent cavalry, to stop him right at the gateway to Asia. And what really stood out at Granicus was Alexander's sheer audacity, his innovative tactics, you could say. The Persians took up a defensive position on the high bank of the river, expecting Alexander to be cautious, maybe wait to cross.
A logical move, probably.
Right. But Alexander wasn't about logic in that sense. He didn't hesitate. He ordered an immediate, direct assault across the river. And he led it himself, at the head of his elite companion cavalry, charging right into the thick of the fighting on the opposite bank. He nearly got killed himself in the melee. It showed incredible coordination between his cavalry and infantry, hitting the Persians before they were fully ready, surprising them with the sheer speed and ferocity of the attack. It was a bold, decisive victory. It shattered that initial Persian defensive line and really signaled right from the start this wasn't going to be a cautious, conventional war. Alexander played by his own rules.
Okay, so he smashes that first defense. Then, not too long after, maybe a year later, 333 BCE, he gets the big one. Darius III himself, the Persian king of kings, brings the main imperial army to face Isis. This must have felt like the main event.
Absolutely. Isis was the first time Alexander faced Darius III directly. And it was a clash of titans, on a landscape that actually seemed to favor the Persians initially. Darius had a huge army, significantly outnumbering Alexander's forces, and he'd chosen this narrow coastal plain, thinking it would sort of cramp Alexander's style, negate his cavalry advantage.
Trying to use the terrain against him.
Exactly. But even though Alexander was outnumbered, his troops were just superbly disciplined, highly trained, incredibly motivated, that Macedonian edge. And Alexander's tactical execution was just brilliant. He saw a weakness, or created one, on the Persian left flank. He personally led his companion cavalry in this devastating charge, punching right through their lines. Meanwhile, his phalanx held the center firm against the bulk of the Persian infantry. Then, crucially, Alexander didn't just pursue the fleeing flank. He wheeled his cavalry inwards, towards the Persian center, directly threatening Darius himself.
Going straight for the king.
Straight for the king. And the psychological impact was massive. Darius, seeing his lines collapsing and Alexander charging towards him, panicked. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. He abandoned his army, his royal treasury, even his own mother, wife, and children, who were then captured by Alexander. Treated well, reportedly, but captured nonetheless.
Wow. The king running away, that must have just destroyed Persian morale.
Utterly. It shattered the image of the invincible King of Kings. It was a huge turning point. Alexander had not only defeated the main Persian army, but had put the emperor himself to flight. The momentum was now decisively with the Macedonians.
But Alexander wasn't just about these big, open-field battles, was he? To control territory, especially coastal regions, you need to take cities, fortified cities. That requires a totally different skill set: patience, engineering, siegecraft. How good was he at that?
He was exceptionally good at it. His skill in siege warfare was just as formidable and often involved incredible innovation and just relentless determination. Early on, he took Halicarnassus, a major Persian naval base on the coast of Asia Minor, after a tough siege in 334 BCE. That was important strategically, but the absolute standout example, the one that really showcases his genius and his, let's say, unwavering will, is the Siege of Tyre.
Ah, yes, Tyre, the island city.
Exactly. Tyre was this ancient Phoenician city, incredibly wealthy, strategically vital because it was a major Persian naval base in the Mediterranean, and it was built on an island but half a mile offshore. The Tyrians thought they were impregnable. They had strong walls, commanded the sea. They defied Alexander. And this siege lasted for 7 months. 7 grueling months in 332 BCE. It was one of the most complex, difficult sieges in ancient history.
So how did he even get to them? They're on an island.
This is the incredible part. Alexander decided, if I can't sail to it easily, I'll walk to it. He ordered his army to build a causeway, a giant mole or land bridge, stretching from the mainland out to the island.
He built land across the sea.
He literally built land across the sea, using rubble from the old mainland part of Tyre, timber brought from mountains miles away, an absolutely staggering feat of engineering and sheer manpower. And they were under constant attack while doing this. Arrows from the walls, attacks from Tyrian ships. He had to build siege towers on the mole itself to protect the workers. Eventually, he gathered his own fleet, blockaded their harbors, brought massive siege engines up the completed causeway, battered down the walls, and stormed the city.
Unbelievable.
It truly was. It showed his adaptability. When one approach didn't work, he tried something completely audacious. It showed his absolute determination he would not be denied. And again, it ended brutally. Thousands of Tyrians were killed in the fighting, and the remaining population, maybe 30,000 again, were sold into slavery. A terrifying message. Resistance, even heroic resistance, would be crushed.
Okay, so Issus was the turning point. Tyrus showed his relentless siegecraft. Then Gaugamela. If Issus shook the empire, Gaugamela basically broke it, right? This feels like the final decisive showdown.
That's exactly right. Gaugamela, fought in 331 BCE near modern-day Iraq, was the biggest, the most critical, and arguably the most tactically brilliant battle of Alexander's entire career. This time, Darius had learned some lessons. He gathered an even larger army. Estimates vary wildly, but maybe hundreds of thousands. Immense numbers, drawn from all corners of his empire. And he chose the battlefield carefully. A wide, flat plain. He even had the ground leveled in places, specifically to give his sided chariots and his masses of cavalry room to operate effectively, hoping to overwhelm Alexander's smaller force through sheer numbers.
Setting the perfect stage for his own army, he thought.
He thought so. But Alexander turned it into his own masterpiece. Tactically complex, but essentially he did something unexpected. He advanced with his right wing angled forward, sort of obliquely, drawing the Persian cavalry on their left flank further and further out, trying to envelop them. This stretched the Persian line, and crucially, it eventually created a gap near the center, close to where Darius himself was positioned.
He deliberately created an opening.
It seems so. Whether by design or brilliant improvisation, he spotted or created that gap. His feelings held the center against immense pressure. And then, at the critical moment, Alexander led his companion cavalry, formed in their famous wedge formation, straight into that gap, like a spearhead aimed directly at Darius. Again,
He just keeps going for the king.
it was his signature move. And again, the coordination was key. The phalanx holding, other cavalry units protecting the flanks. The charge into the gap shattered the Persian center. And for the second time, Darius III saw Alexander coming, saw his lines breaking, and he fled the battlefield. This time, there was no recovery. The Persian army dissolved into a rout. Gaugamela wasn't just a defeat, it was the complete shattering of the Achaemenid Persian Empire's military and political power. The road to Babylon, Susampa, Persepolis, the heartlands of the empire was wide open. Persia, as a world power, was effectively finished.
Incredible. But even after that, after basically conquering Persia, he didn't stop. He kept pushing east, all the way to India, to the edges of what the Greeks thought was the known world. What was driving him, and what did he find there? It must have been totally different.
That's right. The push into India, starting around 327 BCE, took him into entirely new territory, both geographically and militarily. Why did he keep going? Probably a mix of things. Insatiable ambition, maybe? Desire to reach the ends of the earth, genuine curiosity, the momentum of conquest. Hard to say for sure, but the challenges were immense. Brutal terrain, mountains, huge rivers like the Indus, difficult climate, the monsoons, and fierce resistance from local kingdoms. And they had fighting techniques the Macedonians had never encountered before. Most famously, war elephants.
Ah, the elephants at the Hydaspes River.
Exactly. The Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE against King Porus. Porus had a strong army, and crucially, a large corps of war elephants lined up along the riverbank. This was terrifying for Alexander's men and horses. They'd never faced anything like these huge armored beasts in battle before.
How did they even deal with that?
Well, Alexander again used brilliant tactics. He made a big show of preparing to cross at one point, drawing Porus's attention. But then, under the cover of a storm and darkness, he led a force across the river at a different, concealed spot upstream. The battle itself was incredibly fierce. The elephants did cause disruption, but the Macedonians adapted, targeting the mahouts, the drivers, using their long sarissas to wound the elephants' legs and trunks, causing them to panic. Ultimately, Alexander's superior cavalry and infantry coordination won the day. Porus fought bravely, was wounded and captured. Alexander, impressed by his courage, actually reinstated him as a vassal ruler.
So even facing elephants, he wins. But this campaign also seemed to spark something else in him.
It did. While militarily successful, the Indian campaign also seemed to deepen Alexander's intellectual curiosity. He famously spent time talking with Indian philosophers, the gymnosophists or naked wise men. He observed local customs, fauna, flora. It seems to have genuinely fascinated him, reinforcing this openness to other cultures we saw emerging earlier. But it was also the limit. His army, exhausted after years of campaigning, pushed thousands of miles from home, facing monsoon rains and the prospect of even larger armies further east, finally put their foot down. They refused to go further.
The famous mutiny at the Hyphasis River.
Precisely. Alexander pleaded, argued, sulked in his tent, but they wouldn't budge. It was the one time his charisma and authority weren't enough. He finally had to agree to turn back. The eastward expansion was over. 4. The engine of conquest. Alexander's military machine.
We've talked so much about Alexander the Commander, his tactics, his leadership, his personal bravery. But let's zoom in on the army itself. That Macedonian military machine, it wasn't just Alexander's genius, it was the tool he wielded, right? Built on his father Philip's innovations. What made it so incredibly effective? What were the core parts?
You're absolutely right. The army was a phenomenal instrument of war, arguably the best the world had seen up to that point. It was a finely tuned machine. Its strength really came from this revolutionary combination of heavy infantry, the phalanx, and incredibly effective, fast, heavy cavalry. The phalanx was the core, the anvil. And as we mentioned, its key weapon was the sarissa, that super long pike, 13 to maybe even 20 feet long.
Which they held with two hands, right?
It's exactly. Made of tough cornel wood. When the phalanx formed up, maybe 16 ranks deep, the pikes of the first 5 ranks projected forward. This created this dense thicket of spear points sticking out maybe 15, 20 feet in front of the first soldier. An enemy literally had to run onto multiple spear points just to reach the guys holding them. It was an incredibly effective defensive wall, almost impenetrable to frontal assault by traditional infantry or cavalry. It could hold the line, grind down the enemy.
But it sounds kind of unwieldy, too, just this big block of spears.
It was. That was its weakness. While incredibly strong head-on, the phalanx was slow. Hard to maneuver quickly, difficult to turn, and very vulnerable on its flanks and rear, especially on broken ground. And that's where the other key components came in. Alexander mastered combined arms tactics. If the phalanx was the anvil, the hammer was his elite companion cavalry, heteroi. These were heavily armored nobles, superb horsemen, usually led by Alexander himself. They were the decisive straight force. They would exploit weaknesses, deliver shattering charges into the enemy's flank or rear, or punch through gaps like at Gaugamela. Then you also had the hypaspis, or shield bearers. These were elite infantry, but more lightly armored and equipped than the phalangites, maybe with shorter spears and swords. They were more mobile, flexible.
So they could move faster, protect the phalanx flanks.
Exactly. They could bridge the gap between the slower phalanx and the fast cavalry, guard the flanks, undertake rapid assaults, fight in rough terrain where the phalanx struggled. And Alexander was brilliant at using these different elements together. He could divide his army, use feints, complex maneuvers, adapt his tactics mid-battle. It wasn't just a blunt instrument. It was a versatile, adaptable, deadly fighting force.
And what's really interesting, as his campaigns went on, this wasn't just a Macedonian army anymore, was it? As the empire grew, the army itself started to reflect that diversity.
That's a crucial point and really speaks to Alexander's leadership beyond just Macedonians. As he conquered vast territories, he began incorporating soldiers from the peoples he defeated into his own army. This wasn't just auxiliary cannon fodder. He integrated elite units. Think Persian cavalry, who were excellent horsemen, Greek mercenaries, Thracian light infantry and javelin throwers, archers from various regions, eventually even units trained in the Macedonian style but composed of Persians.
So he's using the strengths of the people he conquered.
Yes. It wasn't just a logistical necessity because he needed manpower. It actively enhanced his army's capabilities. This diversity gave him incredible strategic flexibility. He had troops suited for different kinds of warfare, different terrains. He could adopt and adapt to local tactics and skills. He used Persian engineers for sieges, for example. So you're right. By the end, it wasn't just a Macedonian army. It was this multinational force united under his command. It's a testament to his charisma, his organizational skill, his ability to inspire loyalty or maybe enforce obedience among incredibly diverse groups, including those he'd recently fought against. It reflected his evolving vision of a potentially unified empire, beyond conquest. Alexander as administrator and cultural architect.
It's so easy to just focus on the battles, the marching, the sheer drama of the conquests. But like you said, he wasn't just a general. He conquered this enormous territory, including the sophisticated Persian Empire. So he had to rule it. He had to administer it. How did he actually manage such a massive, diverse empire? That's a totally different challenge than leading an army, isn't it?
A completely different challenge, and arguably, in the long run, a much harder one. And this is where Alexander shows aspects that are really quite progressive, even radical, for his time. In the conquered Persian lands, he didn't just come in and tear everything down, replace everyone with Macedonians, which might have been the expected approach. Instead, he showed a surprising, maybe pragmatic, maybe genuine respect for local customs and existing structures. He largely kept the Persian administrative system, the division into provinces called satrapies, because, well, it worked. It was efficient for governing a vast area.
So he kept the Persian framework.
Often, yes. He would usually appoint Macedonians or trusted Greeks to the top positions, the satraps, especially those controlling military power or finance. But he frequently left local Persian officials in place in subordinate roles, or even sometimes shared power at the top between a Macedonian and a Persian. He actively sought collaboration with the Persian aristocracy, integrating them into his new administration rather than alienating them entirely. It was a policy of integration, not just replacement.
And part of that integration involved him personally adopting some Persian customs, right? Which I imagine didn't always go down well with his own Macedonian veterans.
Not at all. This caused huge friction, resentment, even open mutinies among his Macedonian troops and commanders later in his reign. They saw it as him going native, forgetting his roots. But yes, Alexander began adopting elements of Persian royal dress, the diadem, the robes. He adopted some court ceremonies. Most controversially, he married non-Macedonians. His most famous wife was Roxane, a princess from Bactria in what's now Afghanistan. He later also married 2 Persian princesses, daughters of Darius III and a previous king.
Strategic marriages, but also sending a message.
Absolutely. And he went even further. He actively encouraged, even ordered his senior officers and thousands of his ordinary soldiers to marry Persian and other Eastern women. This culminated in the famous mass weddings at Susa in 324 BCE, where maybe 10,000 Macedonian soldiers took Persian brides in a huge ceremony, with Alexander himself officiating and providing dowry.
10,000 weddings at once.
Something like that. It was a deliberate, radical policy aimed at literally fusing the Macedonian and Persian elites, creating a new, unified ruling class for his empire, blending the populations. He also tried to introduce the Persian court practice of proskynesis ritual, bowing or prostration before the king. This caused uproar among the Greeks and Macedonians, who considered such reverence appropriate only for gods, not mortal rulers. He eventually backed down on that one. But all these actions taken together show a leader thinking beyond mere conquest. He seemed to be aiming for some kind of stable, unified, multi-ethnic empire, a truly visionary, if controversial, approach.
Okay, so if we zoom out, these policies respecting local customs, integrating elites, encouraging intermarriage, even adopting dress, this wasn't just about making administration easier, was it? This active blending led to something much bigger, didn't it? A whole new cultural phenomenon.
Exactly. These policies, combined with the sheer scale of interaction forced by his conquests, soldiers, traders, administrators moving across vast distances, were the direct catalyst for what historians call Hellenistic culture. And Hellenistic doesn't just mean Greek, it means Greek-influenced or Greek-like, but crucially, it involved a fusion, a synthesis. It was this dynamic blend of Greek language, art, philosophy, and political ideas with the ancient and sophisticated cultures of Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, even parts of India.
So it's a two-way street, not just Greece imposing its culture.
Ideally, yes, though Greek influence was certainly strong, especially in language and administration in the cities he founded. But it was definitely a mixing. Think about the spread of Greek-style cities across Asia, but those cities having populations from all over. Think about Greek philosophy encountering Eastern religious ideas, leading to new schools of thought like Stoicism, which had roots in both traditions. Think about art becoming more emotional, more realistic, influenced by different aesthetics. Science borrowing knowledge from Babylonian astronomy or Egyptian medicine. Alexander's campaigns dramatically accelerated this process. He smashed down the old barriers between these cultural worlds and forced them into contact, into conversation.
So the deep dive here is that this cultural blending wasn't just some accidental side effect. It was, at least partly, a result of his deliberate policies.
I think that's fair to say. While some blending would have happened anyway through trade, Alexander's actions founding cities intended as melting pots, his marriage policies, his administrative integration actively promoted and accelerated this cultural synthesis on an unprecedented scale. It fundamentally changed the cultural map of the ancient world, creating this interconnected Hellenistic civilization that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for the next 3 centuries, long after his empire itself had fractured. Sexe, the legacy of Alexandria, and the unexpected end.
And when we talk about that Hellenistic legacy, that cultural fusion, one place always comes to mind. Alexandria in Egypt. It's maybe his most famous city founding, and it became this legendary center of learning. What made Alexandria so special? How did it embody that vision?
Alexandria is really the prime example, the jewel in the crown of that Hellenistic vision. Founded by Alexander himself in 331 BCE, right after he conquered Egypt. Its location was brilliant on the Mediterranean coast, at the Nile Delta, perfectly positioned for trade between Egypt, Greece, and the wider Mediterranean world. It was meticulously planned as a major city from the start. But it became far more than just a trading hub. Under the Ptolemies, the dynasty founded by one of Alexander's generals who took control of Egypt after his death, Alexandria became the undisputed intellectual capital of the ancient world. And the heart of that was the legendary Great Library of Alexandria and the Mouseion, a kind of research institute attached to it.
The library everyone's heard of, even if just the name.
Exactly. It wasn't just a library in our sense. It was this huge state-funded institution dedicated to collecting, translating, editing, and studying basically all the written knowledge of the known world. They aimed to acquire a copy of every significant scroll, Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, others. Estimates suggest it held hundreds of thousands of scrolls at its peak. And the Mouseion attracted the greatest scholars of the age, poets, mathematicians, astronomers, doctors, geographers, providing them with stipends, accommodation, resources to just think and write and discover.
It's like a giant university and think tank rolled into one.
Precisely. And the results were staggering. Think of Euclid systematizing geometry there. Eratosthenes calculating the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Herophilus making huge advances in anatomy and medicine, possibly through human dissection. Aristarchus proposing that the Earth revolved around the sun centuries before Copernicus. Alexandria was this incredible melting pot of knowledge, directly fulfilling that potential for cultural and intellectual cross-pollination that Alexander's conquest had unleashed. And it's vital to see Alexandria not as some unique outlier, but as the most prominent example of a wider trend. The entire Hellenistic age, roughly the 3 centuries after Alexander's death, was this period of incredible innovation and cultural dynamism across the vast area his conquest had opened up. We see major advancements spurred by this mixing of cultures. Science, as we mentioned. Philosophy saw the rise of major new schools like Stoicism and Epicureanism, grappling with questions of ethics and happiness in this new, larger, more uncertain world. Art became more realistic, more dramatic, more focused on individual emotion. Architecture saw grand new styles, huge public building projects. Urban planning became sophisticated, with cities like Antioch in Syria, Pergamon in Asia Minor, Seleucia on the Tigris becoming major centers alongside Alexandria.
So Alexander didn't just leave ruined cities, he sort of cleared the ground for new growth.
In a way, yes. His conquests, destructive as they often were, created this vast interconnected space where ideas, people, and goods could move more freely than ever before. It accelerated the exchange, pushed boundaries, fostered competition and innovation between the successor kingdoms. The Hellenistic age was a direct, if complex, consequence of Alexander's life and actions.
And then, after all that, the conquests, the vision, the founding of cities like Alexandria, it all just stops. So abruptly. His sudden death in Babylon, 323 BCE. He's only 32 years old. It must have sent shockwaves through this empire he'd built but hadn't really had time to consolidate.
It was a cataclysm, absolutely devastating for the stability of the empire. He died relatively young, unexpectedly, and crucially, without a clear, designated adult heir. His wife Roxane was pregnant, and he had an illegitimate son, but no obvious successor who could command the loyalty of his powerful, ambitious generals. The exact cause of death is still debated. Maybe malaria, typhoid fever, pancreatitis from heavy drinking, exhaustion, or maybe poison, though that's less likely according to most historians. Regardless, the moment he died, the glue holding the empire together dissolved.
Chaos.
Complete chaos. Thus his leading generals, the diadochoi, the successors almost immediately began scheming and fighting amongst themselves for control. There were decades of brutal, complex wars, shifting alliances, betrayals. The wars of the diadochoi tore the empire apart. What emerged from this crucible were several large Hellenistic kingdoms, ruled by the dynasties founded by these generals. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took the vast eastern territories. Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria. Antigonus eventually secured Macedonia and Greece.
So the political unity he created just shattered.
It shattered almost instantly upon his death. The dream of a single unified empire died with him. But, and this is crucial, while the political empire fragmented, the cultural and intellectual legacy, that Hellenistic world we've been talking about, persisted and even flourished within these successor kingdoms. The Greek language remained dominant in administration and culture. The cities continued to be centers of learning and trade. The cultural fusion continued. So the political structure broke, but the deeper cultural impact endured for centuries.
Yeah.
7. The man behind the legend. Personality and leadership style.
We've covered the massive events, the battles, the empire, the legacy, but let's try to get a sense of Alexander the man. Who was he really? The sources, ancient histories, written sometimes centuries later, paint this incredibly complex picture, full of contradictions. What was his personality actually like? What drove him?
It's tough because the sources themselves are complex, sometimes biased, written after the fact. But a consistent picture emerges of certain core traits. Undeniably, he possessed incredible leadership qualities. Bravery is the first thing everyone mentions, almost reckless bravery. He consistently led from the front, charged into the thickest fighting, suffered numerous serious wounds.
Sharing the danger with his men.
Absolutely. That inspired phenomenal loyalty, almost fanatical devotion from his soldiers. They'd follow him anywhere. He was also incredibly determined, focused, with an almost superhuman stamina and drive. And charismatic, he knew how to inspire people. Highly intelligent, quick thinking, endlessly curious. Those are the positive traits, the ones that made his success possible.
But there was a darker side too, wasn't there?
Oh, definitely. The sources don't shy away from that.
Yeah.
He could be authoritarian, demanding absolute obedience. He had a ferocious temper, particularly, it seems, when drinking, which he apparently did heavily at times. This could lead to impulsive, terrible acts. The most infamous is probably the murder of Clitus the Black. Clitus was a veteran officer, had saved Alexander's life at Granicus, a close friend. But during a drunken feast and argument, Alexander, enraged by something Clitus said, grabbed the spear and killed him. He was reportedly devastated afterwards, but the act itself was brutal. And we see instances of what looks like extreme cruelty, the destruction of Thebes, the massacre at Tyre, sometimes calculated political terror, perhaps, but still cruel. Later in his reign, there are signs of increasing paranoia, suspicion, maybe megalomania, fueled by his incredible success and that belief in his own divinity. He executed Parmenion, one of his most experienced and loyal generals, along with his son, on charges of treason that many historians find dubious.
So this complex mix. Inspiring hero and, at times, a terrifying tyrant.
Exactly. He wasn't a simple character. He embodied both the highest ideals of heroism and leadership and some pretty dark, ruthless impulses, often simultaneously.
Which brings us back to that education with Aristotle. How did those lessons in ethics and philosophy square with this darker side, with the ruthlessness? Did he just forget everything Aristotle taught him when ambition called?
That's a fascinating tension, isn't it? I don't think he simply forgot it. We see evidence that he did apply some of those principles. His interest in science, his curiosity, his founding of cities intended as centers of learning, his attempts at creating a more stable, integrated governance structure rather than just plundering these, arguably reflect some of those higher ideals, that philosophical grounding. He understood the concepts of justice and reason in administration, even if applied selectively. But at the end of the day, he was an absolute monarch forged in a brutal world, driven by colossal ambition. When he perceived a threat to his power, or when ruthlessness seemed necessary to achieve his strategic goals, like making an example of Thebes or Tyre, he didn't hesitate.
So pragmatism trumped philosophy when push came to shove.
It often seems that way. The demands of maintaining control over a vast, newly conquered, often resentful empire, and the sheer intoxication of unprecedented power likely overshadowed the more abstract ethical lessons. He used the tools Aristotle gave him: logic, rhetoric, political understanding, but ultimately wielded them in service of his own ambition. He was a product of both his idealistic education and the harsh realities of ancient warfare and power politics, a truly complex figure driven by both high ideals and a relentless will to power. 8. The echo through time. Alexander's enduring impact.
So let's try to sum up. We've gone through his life, his campaigns, his vision, his death. Looking back now from our vantage point, what is Alexander's ultimate legacy? Beyond the battles won and lost, beyond the empire that fell apart, what did he fundamentally change? How does his influence still echo today?
His legacy is immense and multifaceted, stretching far beyond his own short life. He fundamentally reshaped the ancient world, and his influence continued through the Roman era, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, right up to modern times. Firstly, his campaigns completely redrew the map, not just politically for a time, but culturally and economically. He massively expanded the horizons of the Greek world, bringing it into direct, sustained contact with the ancient civilizations of the Near East, Egypt, Persia, even India. This dramatically increased trade and cultural interaction across vast distances. He connected worlds that had previously only had limited contact. You could argue he was an early agent of globalization, in a way.
Opening up the world.
Opening up the world, yes. And spreading Greek language and culture, Hellenism, which became a dominant influence across the Near East for centuries, even under Roman rule. Secondly, his military genius. His tactics, his use of combined arms, his logistical planning, his leadership style, these were studied and emulated by generals for millennia. Caesar, Pompey, Napoleon. Countless military leaders look back to Alexander as the model conqueror and strategist.
So a textbook for warfare.
In many ways, yes. He set a standard for military command that few have ever matched. Thirdly, as we've discussed extensively, the Hellenistic age itself, that entire era of intellectual ferment, scientific discovery, philosophical development, artistic innovation, it was a direct consequence of the world Alexander created. The advancements made in Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon in fields like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, literature. These had a profound and lasting impact on the development of Western and, to some extent, Eastern civilization. Much of that knowledge was later absorbed by the Romans and eventually rediscovered in the Renaissance.
So he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a catalyst for centuries of progress.
An unintentional catalyst in some ways, perhaps, but a catalyst nonetheless. His actions created the conditions for that flourishing. He connected people and ideas on an unprecedented scale. So his legacy is this complex mix. The brilliant general, the visionary empire builder, even if the empire didn't last, the sometimes ruthless ruler, and the unwitting father of a whole new era of cultural exchange and intellectual advancement. He truly changed the course of history. Outro.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it's just undeniable, isn't it? Alexander the Great remains this towering, incredibly complex figure. He's a symbol of military leadership at its peak, sure, but also a fascinating, if sometimes troubling, example of state governance, of attempting cross-cultural integration on a massive scale, and even indirectly of sparking scientific progress. That life, so short but so packed, really was this extraordinary balancing act, or maybe a constant struggle between raw power and these grander ideals, a legacy that definitely still makes us think.
Absolutely. His impact just resonates down through the centuries, influencing leaders, thinkers, artists, military strategy for over 2,000 years. Even though his life was brief and his political empire fractured right after he died, the cultural, intellectual, and strategic shockwaves he sent out were so powerful, so transformative, that they absolutely secured his place as one of history's most significant and impactful figures. A true turning point.
Definitely. And maybe as a final thought for you, the listener, something to chew on after all this. Considering Alexander's relentless ambition, his incredible military success, but also those unique policies, adopting Persian dress, the mass marriages at Susa, trying to integrate elites, what do you think his ultimate goal really was? Was he genuinely trying to unite the known world to create some kind of fused Hellenistic Persian civilization, a true one world vision, however flawed? Or was all that cultural integration just a really smart, pragmatic, maybe even cynical tool? A clever means to consolidate his conquests, control his vast new territories, and keep the empire stable. And maybe more broadly, what does his story, that mix of idealism and brutal pragmatism, tell us about leadership, ambition, and the complex relationship between power and culture, even in our own world today? Lots to think about there. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary life and the truly enduring legacy of Alexander the Great.